But also in the case of Iran, I mean, just to bring it back to Iran, there is, I would argue, a very important political secularist movement in Iran. The core of the Green Movement has reconciled its own sort of political theology with the idea of political secularism. And in fact, in the Green Movement Charter, there is a reference to the need for preserving the independence of religious institutions and religious groups from the state. And so it's somewhat of an acknowledgement. And there's been a very fascinating and powerful and extensive and deep debate among Iranian reformists and Democrats on this whole question of secularism and responding and resolving this tension. So Muslim polities have to come to terms based on their own historical experience with this idea of political secularism. I think it's happening right now, and I suspect these debates are going to eventually surface in the case of the Arab world based on their own historical experience.
I do see that there are definitely seeds of seeing religious leaders wanting to rein in the abuse of religious authority. I mean, in Iraq, of course, you have a Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani who has said, I'm not going to get involved directly in politics. That's not my job as a Grand Ayatollah, essentially.
Right.
He will have his say, but he will not say, do this based on my religious authority. And to some extent, I mean, he didn't say it the same way, but I think Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, he was also saying the Supreme Leader has overstepped his bounds and overreached his authority. So there are definitely roots at the very highest levels in the religious Shia tradition saying maybe we need to pull back. But the current Supreme Leader and former one, Khomeini, has gone out of his way to use religion as a tool to squelch dissent. They're doing their best to keep the secular opposition weak. But I think eventually, the tide will turn against them. But the question in my mind is they are making it hard for the Green Movement to rally and sustain itself. They're also undermining legitimate religious place in political discourse. 5-10 years from now, when the regime collapses, what will replace it? Because they're busily undermining the religious voice in Iran.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with that. I mean, it's a very similar situation, I think, to moments in the Western political tradition, in the sense that the experience of religion in politics was such a bitter one and a negative one in terms of the abuse of power, in terms of really fundamentally the question of the problem of promoting religious intolerance, that one of the lessons that was sort of learned was, in order to preserve the integrity of religion, that the idea of some sort of separation was good. Not only was it good for politics, but it was good for the integrity of religion, to preserve its own sort of integrity and not having it associated with corrupt sort of political practices. You see something similar taking place in the case of Iran. There are voices who are effectively making the same argument that we've seen in other societies, where the experience of an intimate embrace and connection between religion and politics has produced a series of lessons. Not only is it bad for politics, but it's also bad for religion. And so, no one has really written, I think, a really good study of this, but my own sort of sense of what has taken place and is taking place in Iran, particularly among the younger crop of religious seminarians, students who are in religious training in the holy cities of Qom in particular, is that there is this deep sort of reassessment and rethinking and a gravitation toward the ideas and the views of Ayatollah Montazeri, and also the example of Ayatollah Sistani, who really is the most prestigious and authoritative living Shia marja, or theologian, within the Shia tradition. That model actually works a lot better for society than the Iranian Khomeini sort of theory of religious state. And so you see these debates taking place in Iran. I mean, it's been 32 years, and it's not been a positive experience. The regime goes out of its way to actually prevent a public debate and discussion about this very issue. Has the past 32 years been a good experience, both for Iranian society, both for its political system, and for the integrity of religion, in this case Shia Islam? And I think most people would conclude that it has not been. And the fact that the regime sort of goes out of its way to, in fact, even arrest people who may publicly suggest that religion and state needs to be separate indicates how the regime is deeply fearful of an open airing of this debate, because it knows it can't win. And of course, its entire political legitimacy is really anchored on this particular theme. So it's a very important issue. I think it's produced a lot of lessons. I think in the aftermath of democratic transition, there will be a very strong current of opinion, not only among secular segments of society, but critically among religious segments of society, who will argue that, yes, we need some form of what I would call political secularism, because it's good both for religion and for politics. And I think that is an important development. When you have religious groups in a emerging democratic polity signing on to the liberal democratic project, and particularly signing on to the concept of political secularism, that's an important transformation because it broadens the base of support for this concept, and it ensures that it has greater anchoring in the political culture of, in this case, Iran, which is an important, I think, prerequisite for the sustaining of a liberal democratic polity.
One of the things that has flown under the radar, a lot of people haven't paid attention to the Supreme Leader's last trip to Qom last year. It didn't seem so successful because he was not openly embraced. And I think that demonstrated that there are some very serious splits in the religious tradition there. And the shoring up of his religious credentials that he hoped to happen didn't really seem to happen. Moving on to the most recent things on unrest, it's funny, we have the unique and odd situation of Iran and Syria, and then Iran looking at all the other unrest in the area, claiming it's being inspired by the 1979 revolution, which is a heck of a long time for inspiration to strike. Mm-hmm. But then, saying little or nothing about the unrest in Syria and being on the wrong side ideologically of the legitimate aspirations of Syria. It's hard to make sense of how this will all come out or make any prediction for what will happen in Syria. And if the Assad regime is destabilized, how will that affect Iran? I don't even know that I have a specific question. Just what are your impressions of the situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot to say on this particular theme, both in terms of the propaganda that the Iranian regime has been generating in response to the Arab revolts that have been taking place. But and it's easy to sort of celebrate them when they are taking place in countries that are adversaries of Iran and that are closely allied with the United States. So in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, you can celebrate them and try and interpret them and spin them as being manifestations and inspired by the Iranian example of 1979, leaving aside the fact that as soon as the Iranian supreme leader said this, that he was repudiated by the Muslim Brotherhood, who said that these are nationalist revolts that are not religious sectarian movements, but are really broad-based nationalist movements. That's been the propaganda line of the regime in terms of interpreting them. They've extended that to the case of Bahrain, but of course in the case of Syria it poses huge challenges for them because they are similar revolts inspired by the same sort of grievances, but the Iranian regime has been very silent on them, and they've actually been speaking in sort of very confused ways. On the one hand, their supreme leader is saying that these are Islamically inspired revolts. On the other hand, Ahmadinejad is saying that these are revolts that are inspired by the machinations of the West. He's said that in the context of Libya. I think he's also said it recently in the context of Syria. And so the regime is speaking in a very confused way, and I think that confusion is a reflection that these revolts are very much taking place and inspired in ways that do not reflect well on the Islamic Republic. The other sort of dimension of this is that at the same time that Iran is celebrating pro-democracy movements in the Arab world, it's cracking down on those same pro-democracy movements at home. In the case of the Green Movement, Iran is celebrating and highlighting the plight of Shia Muslims in Bahrain, but at the same time it's cracking down on Sunni Muslims in its own Arabic-speaking provinces. Regionally, there's huge implications here in terms of Iran's influence in the region. Syria is its ally. Syria is the main conduit for supporting Hezbollah. If there were to be a political transformation in Syria, it would have huge consequences for Iran's regional reach, particularly in the Lebanese theater of operation.
I can't help but wonder, this may be a simplification, but when you look at the recent wave of democratic movements, does it come down to if those intelligence, security, military are not willing to support the government, then that government's going away? Is it just that simple, or am I oversimplifying something?
Well, if you're referring to the Arab world, these demonstrations, yes, I think these authoritarian regimes are really controlled by the Ministry of Intelligence and the Ministry of Information and then the security services. Whoever has control over those ministries effectively controls the countries in question. An important, I think, marker to look at in terms of trying to assess the level and extent and the depth of democratization is to what extent is the structure of power really changing in these societies, and to what extent are the major decisions still being decided within these ministries of coercion. If you look at the case of Tunisia, you see there's been a major transformation. In the case of Egypt, it's a much more mixed picture, but there's a lot of signs for optimism. You're seeing things taking place in Egypt that you couldn't imagine would take place. And one indication of this is that these ministries of repression, of what I call the ministries ministries of repression, the Information Ministry, the Interior Ministry.
I think that's apt.
They no longer have the ability, particularly in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, to clamp down on freedom of expression. I mean, the press is now really opened up in these countries. They're free. You can't arrest and sort of incarcerate people in the same way that you could a year ago. So I think that's an indication that things are changing. The fact that Mubarak can be, arrested and interrogated and questioned over the killing of his citizens and over corruption charges suggests that these ministries of coercion and repression are no longer operating in the way that they did. That's not to say that, repression is still not taking place. In the case of Egypt, it's the military council that's still in power, and there's been a lot of abuses that have taken place, since February 11th by the military. But I'm cautiously optimistic that things are headed in the right direction. I think that the structure of power is starting to change, and it's going to take a sustained, reinvigorated civil society. It's going to take a more hospitable international context, and particularly a set of policies from the United States and Europe that will be conducive to democratization. I think that is happening, so that's actually a good sign. So I think things are changing, and I think they're changing for the better. And so I'm of the view that, Tunisia is the most brightest example and in case that we have in the Arab Islamic world in terms of democratic transformation. Egypt is still very much a mixed picture, but I'm cautiously optimistic. As we move to Bahrain, as we move to Syria, the picture there is much darker, largely because of the extreme brutality of these regimes, much greater in the case of Syria, where we're seeing levels of repression that are reminiscent of Ceausescu and of Tiananmen Square. The case of Yemen is still, I think, cautiously optimistic. I'm still cautiously optimistic about Libya looking forward. So it's a mixed picture, but, I think in many ways the tide of history has turned, and there's genuine reason for sort of optimism.
As that tide goes, a couple of things I read most recently, both by Mohammed Ali Jafari, the commander of the IRGC. On the one hand, he was recently quoted saying that he wants to expand the IRGC, expand its ability to hit back against its enemies, although he didn't define who those enemies were. But on the other hand, he was complaining that he's not getting enough recruits joining the IRGC, which seems to suggest that tide of people willing to associate themselves with the regime is shifting away from them. And it just makes me wonder, when does Iran hit that tipping point where there's a demonstration and they call on the Basij or the IRGC foot soldiers and they say, no, I don't think we're going to put this one down.
Right. No, I mean, that's a very important point. I mean, what we see in all of these democratic transitions, the key sort of turning point, the key sort of moment to watch for is splits within the security services in the military. I mean, we saw that in the case of Tunisia, where when the army was ordered to sort of repress the protests, they refused to obey the orders, and Ben Ali had to flee. We saw it in the case of Egypt. The army refused to crack down. And I think that's going to be the moment whenever there's another demonstration, whether the commanders are going to follow orders that are given to them from their leaders to sort of repress popular protests. I saw a report a couple of months ago, a revealing report in the context of Iran, that the regime was recruiting a lot of young recruits from the villages and from smaller towns to come into the city to participate in the crushing of street protests, and it was reluctant to draw upon urban-based Basij and Revolutionary Guard support for these acts of repression and containing popular protests. And I thought that was revealing, because it suggests that even among the Basij and the Revolutionary Guards, those that are based in the cities, that there is questions about their loyalty, and if ever push comes to shove, will those people, engage in the acts of repression that the regime needs to quell a popular uprising. And I think that suggests that because these security services and organizations are urban-based, and they do have, connection to the popular sort of core grievances that people have politically and economically, that their loyalty may be not where the regime wants it to be in terms of relying on them to behave in a manner that will preserve the Islamic Republic.
That's interesting. I saw something along those lines. It was the same report, but what you said just put it in a different context. The report I saw was talking about how very young kids, as young as 14, 15, were being recruited. And it was just complaining about that from a human rights standpoint, that they're taking 15-year-olds, putting truncheons in their hands and having them go bash people on the head. But it wasn't really examining the larger implication, which you just kind of illuminated right there. With what does the use of those non-urban kids tell us about where they stand within their own ranks? Dr. Hashemi, thanks for coming on the Iran This Week podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to answer questions and share a bit of your wisdom with us.
My pleasure. Keep up the great work. I appreciated the opportunity to share my views on Iran and the broader politics of the Middle East.
That concludes the podcast for the week ending 29 April 2011. Please send your questions and comments to IranThisWeek@artkeller.com. Goodbye and Khoda Hafez.